Good day. The hero slays the dragon, topples the tyrant, closes shut the jaws of oblivion. So, what did he do after that? The Gary Stew, ladies and gentlemen, is the male equivalent of the Mary Sue. Old Gary rides up on a massive charger and by his own hand becomes king. Sadly, not everyone can be a King Conan. Conan the Cimmerian was a badass, but he was a badass that wanted his, and he wanted to be left alone. Many a Gary Stew wants to save the world and make it better. But what is better for one person is not so much better for someone else. Add an existential threat to that, and you have a recipe for the old ends justify the means excuse. In Star Wars, in both the universe and out, many people talked about how Palps had to be evil and cruel because the Yuuzhan Vong were on their way, and thus the ends justified the means. Tell that to Alderaan and all the political prisoners. So what if you had a Gary Stew that was good at everything, killed all the bad guys, and thus made the land free and clear to grow to new heights? Well, let's cue up the oft-forgotten C.S. Lewis quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. Those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience." So with that in mind, Shadow of the Conqueror, The Chronicles of Everfall by Shad M Brooks. I picked up this book when trying to find a fantasy book of sufficient quality. Those are harder than you would think for me to find. Either I've already read it, or it's crap, or at least that's what it seems like to me. I came across this book entirely by accident, and the premise seemed cool enough. So I gave it a shot, and found it to be boring in the first couple of chapters, and threw it back in the pile. But a few months later, I got really desperate and picked it back up again and finally gave it its due and found that it was Alpha Prime in quality. So with that, let's crack it open and take a look. The novel begins in the first-person perspective, and it's from the perspective of the main character of the novel. The main character is named Dalen Namarin, aka Dalus, aka the Great Bastard. This first-person bit will be found at the start of every chapter and is part of an in-universe journal written by Dalen himself. And like the rest of the chapter that continues after this, is just him whining. There is a massive perspective whiplash when we transition from this journal segment to the main bulk of the chapter, which is a third-person perspective. I really think that Shad should have just started in the third-person perspective and then, at the beginning of Chapter 2, started showing these journal pages. The first chapters for the novel are sadly rather boring. Before we get to the chapters themselves, let's actually establish the universe itself. The novel takes place on the continent of Telos. This world is completely constructed, and I think that old Shad was rather fond of the floating continent concept because Telos is one giant floating landmass. The universe is also similar to a Pac-Man stage. What is up becomes down, because the universe is just a tiny bubble around Telos. If you fall off the continent, you fall until you come out of the top. The day is also endless unless some dark magic brings upon the night. The sun is not actually in the universe with Telos, but can be seen slightly outside of it, hence why no one gets cooked. The world itself is a Magitech one. You have cards and airships, but swords are still a mainline weapon. And unto this Dalen. He was a Gary Stew that fought the fell forces of darkness. Literally, this is a big fuck-off magic bad guy universe. I know that name kind of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Like with Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, and Game of Thrones to a certain extent, the Chronicles of Everfall universe has the big fuck-off magic bad guy in the form of the Shade. They are a hive-minded bastards that want to take over the world. They also work a bit like Coas in Warhammer. If a normal Humie is in so much as a shadow for a short period of time, they can become corrupted by the dark, and eventually turn into a Shade themselves. And like Chaos, you have greater and lesser Shade, with one big Shade kind of running the entire show. When the Shade get powerful enough, they bring upon the night, and humanity has to fight them kind of like a blight in Dragon Age. The Shade are more powerful than your average human, but not so powerful they cannot be fought with swords and standard fantasy melee weapons. Dalen was your typical RPG protagonist, but instead of short brown hair, he has short blue hair, because I guess Shad really likes swords and animu. So our plucky protagonist saved the day and sealed the Shade away, and then saved the lands of man by killing the corrupt rulers. Sadly, Dalen really liked negative karma runs, and thus started killing everyone who could possibly be a threat to him. Yes, that means he also killed the families of the corrupt rulers as well. And then he turned into a backstabbing bastard. And as you go through the book, you find that Dalen basically was an amalgamation of Napoleon, Vladimir Lenin, and Papa Stalin. He became the very thing he hated, all in the name of the greater good. Eventually, he was overthrown and went into hiding for 2 decades, and in that time, he learned that, killing people is bad, okay? And raping people is bad too, okay? And communism is bad, okay? And if you do those things, you're bad. And well, he does eventually find a way to reform. And at the beginning of the book, he laments the crappiness of his personality and plans on killing himself. First, I know it seems far-fetched that a dirty commie bastard like Dalen could figure out that being an asshole is bad, but let's think of the biggest and most famous asshole of all time. Darth Vader. He tortured his own daughter, had his own son-in-law tortured, killed many loyal Imperials, cut his son's hand off, and as Anakin, killed Sand People kids, killed Jedi kids, and murdered his wife. And yet, at the end of Return of the Jedi, we the audience just kind of accept that that bastard had some good in him, and that was mainly because Mark Hamill just kind of said so. So if you can accept Dark Vador as having good, then Dalen is not that much of a stretch, and the novel does a very good job of explaining why he went bad and how he went good. Sadly, the first part of the novel suffers from the lack of a good hook. What I just told you will make reading it easier, but when you first read the novel, it's just some old-ass guy whining about his failures for a couple of chapters. These chapters also have a metric crap ton of exposition, which is understandable as this novel is setting up a whole new universe, but still, some of it will be better off in a supplement. So eventually, Dalen finally chucks himself off the side of a cliff in order to kill himself. He is holding, oh good god, more exposition. He is holding a light stone and a dark stone, and with this combination, he thinks he should be able to extra kill himself. Well, it does the opposite. It rejuvenates him, makes him young, and gives him magical powers. Dude Bro the Conqueror has about as much luck with killing himself as Gotrek does. Although with how horrid Age of Sigmar is, with its shitty Duardans and Stormcast Eternals, I bet Gotrek is wishing to Grimnir that he just went out with Warhammer Fantasy. Anyway, Linkin Park aside, Dalen turns into a young and spry Jedi, aka Lightbringer, and sets off on the road of the plot. Rather, it doesn't, because now Dalen has to learn how his new light powers work. This part can also be a bit tedious unless you enjoy going through the logic of powers. Thus, we enter the backstory of the writer himself. Shad M Brooks, if that is your real name, sir, is better known by the YouTube handle Shad Diversity. Despite the title, he is sufficiently based. Shad is an Australian YouTuber that discusses swords, pop culture, gambesons, pop culture, and swords. He is also a hard enough kind of guy, oh my, and he loves to stroke that science. And thus, this is a very hard fantasy novel with hard rules and consistency. And I get the feeling that Shad enjoys flexing that brain of his, which is cool if you like that sort of thing. However, I will say that once you get past all the exposition and Aussie Shad flexing, what you have is a really excellent story with memorable characters and plot lines. So glaze those eyes for the long explanations and unglaze them for the great story. So the stage is set for an epic tale of a bad guy that was given a second chance to be good. The first thing he does is realize that we came here to read about swords, and so he axes the plans to do something boring, like being a super farmer or teacher, and thankfully realizes that when you buy a book written by a sword dude, we expect some fucking sword fights. So with that in mind, Dalen decides to head home and get his epic sword of Ascendant Justice, and you too can have it in League of Legends for only $29.95. To get there though, Dalen has to try and not get found out as Dalen the Conqueror, and thus he pretends to be Daelis' son, and since he has the Force, he also passes himself off as a Jedi, Lightbringer. In his early interactions with Humies, he does his best to be nice, but Dalen is still thankfully a colossal dick. Just because he doesn't want to be a filthy commie anymore doesn't mean that he is going to be a nice guy in a bow tie. That one's for you, Shad. When he is placed in a situation where he has to deal with annoying people, he acts like a former commie would act. He encounters a simple farming family and is nice enough, but doesn't know how to act like a kid and comes off as dickish. Then the son of the family wants to join Daelis on his quest, and Dalen completely humiliates him. So yeah, Dalen went from low karma run to neutral karma run. Yeah, Seems legit. When Dalen gets to the nearest city, he decides to crash in an alley, only to be almost killed by a random murder hobo. And Dalus, instead of beating the crap out of him, cuts him literally into pieces. Got that bloody mess perk, I see, Dalen. This bit of slice and dice is par for the course in Dalen's mind. But the extremely brutal murder of the murder hobo actually bothers him, as he feels as though he is slipping into his old ways. This random murder does move the plot forward a bit, as this puts two Lightbringers on his tail, Lyra and Kuseg. Thanks, Shad. You couldn't make these names easy to pronounce. From now on, he's Cusack. They are set upon his trail, and it's not that difficult of a trail to follow because Dalen, while definitely powerful in many aspects, used stealth and subterfuge as his dump stats. Dalen eventually makes it to his former home and picks up his first companion named Arik, or A-Rock, which is both a self-insert for Shaddy Boy and a Shad joke. Shad's humor is that of dads and bad puns. The name Arik or A-Rock, however you want to pronounce it, or a rock, get it? As he acts as Dalen's emotional and moral rock. And wouldn't you know it, this brand of Shad humor got Shad both a hot wife and most of a castle. But does he have a PTR 91 and a K98K? I think not. Check and meet. The general is awesome aside, A-Rock had a vision of accompanying Dalen, and then it's found out that Dalus the Conqueror lived at that house, where Dalen just so happened to be searching and knew where everything was. And well, things get complicated. Dalen is able to convince everyone that he is totally not a rejuvenated Dalus the Conqueror, even though Dalen has about a -5 in subterfuge. And he tells Arik that he doesn't want to become like the great bastard, and Arik believes him and joins his quest to fight the Eviltons. Except Dalen is not yet on his quest to fight the Eviltons. Oh, and at Dalen's old shack, he picks up some sword that I guess is cool, and it's called Imperious. It's a sonical. Oh my god, just say it's a sword. It's not like it's a goddamn high power. In short, Dalus, in addition to being a close combat monster, is also a sunsmith and uses his sunsmithing skills to create magical light weapons that are better than all the other weapons that ever were created. All glory to Dalen. Also, he's an airship pilot. And also he's supposed to be very good in other ways as well, that shall remain nameless. In short, he is the Gariest stew whoever garried it up, and that's what really makes this novel that interesting, as we get to see a Gary stew go bad and get all that sweet comeuppance. Imperious was Dalen's greatest weapon and used it to cut all the bad guys into pieces, and of course it was more durable than all the other weapons because let's move on to the plot. The plot is now to go to the Central Hall of Records and forge Dalen's papers so that no one learns the truth that he is really Dalus. But thankfully, despite this rather boring sounding quest, we get some cool high-flying adventures in between. The novel is very hard, but it still has a sense of fun. Dalus and A-Rock hitch a ride on an airship and they get waylaid by air pirates, and an epic battle ensues. But Dalus is still a bastard, and he buzzsaws his way through even surrendered pirates. There is, however, some justification for him killing the surrendered pirates. Using the Force, the light powers, he's able to determine each pirate's inner light. The brighter the light, the better the person. Although not necessarily. It is also said that brightly lit people can be evil so long as they think they're doing good. And so with this, Dalen is able to determine all the dim pirates and he kills them all. And then he kills his own son, although he didn't know this at the time, by impaling him. Our hero, ladies and gentlemen! A-Rock is a lot like Colossus in the Deadpool films. He is always getting pissed off by Dalen's murder hobo antics, but it all was for a good cause, as they did rescue a bunch of girls about to be sold into slavery. Oh yeah, the book deals with some harsh realities. People love to romanticize the past. Chicks especially love those Renaissance times. But the real Renaissance was not all turkey legs and hot chicks in chainmail bikinis. Slavery existed, and sex slavery was not considered a bad thing, or even a thing in general. And the novel actually discusses this concept. The novel also discusses the issues faced by rape survivors, but it is not done in a heavy-handed way, nor does it feel tacked on for emotional blackmail. Everything but the constant exposition and science crap is balanced excellently. The novel gets just dark enough to make a point, and then then we get more high-flying adventures, such as when Dalen takes out a pirate base along with some of the Shade monsters. The middle chapters meander a bit. There is no real overarching plot of any real importance constantly driving the characters, which I feel is a good thing. We get time to get a feel for the universe, a real feel at times. Come on, Shad, no one needs to read the mass times energy equation to understand how airships work. Just say they work due to Darkstone. No one cares. The plot is a slow burn that does not feel drawn out or boring, and you never just shout at the book to get on with it. If anything, Shad knows how to keep the reader on their toes, and he even knows how to make the reader uncomfortable at times. Dalen was a really bad guy. He liked the old, shall we say, rapey, remember? And guess what Lyra was? Oh, dear, indeed. The novel is not all about Dalen, thankfully, and Eric gets some good backstory and characterization as well. Lyra and Cusac's search for Dalen is as entertaining as the A-plot, and the two characters have great chemistry, and there is a great deal of humor to be found between the two. The novel will finally come to a head when several things happen at once. Dalen learns that some crazy cultist, the cult in question, wants to bring back Dalen's commie empire. They decide to crash a mountain into the capital city, and Dalen has to stop them. But it's just been learned that Dalen really is the great bastard, and so he has to fight his new friends to save the city. Can a bad guy turned good stem the tide? Well, buy the book so Shad can pick up more mortar for his castle and find out. So what we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is an Alpha Prime book. I read this over a period of like 2 days. PTRs don't pay for themselves, and I sadly can no longer stay up till 3 in the morning anymore. The novel kept my attention the entire time, and I never felt myself nodding off due to a boring bit, and I even checked the page count to make sure I wasn't running out of book too fast. The characters are what really sell this novel. Dallas is an entertaining guy, and he does have good chemistry with the rest of the cast, and never comes off as an idiot, and Shad never shills for him either. The novel fully shows just how bad a guy like Dallas would be. He is a serial rapist and a serial murderer, but he legitimately tries to turn a new leaf, but the novel never lets him forget his evil past. And that right there is what separates this novel from the pack. Your hero is the worst of bad guys, but you kind of guiltily root for him all the same. It makes the reader really think about the concepts of good and evil, and how the most vile person imaginable will always see themselves as the good guy of purity. It's the rare person like Dalen that can see past their own bullshit and try and reform. Dalen never becomes a traditional hero like Han Solo or Master Chief. He is always a right bastard, even when he's trying to be good. He is arrogant and condescending, but he at least knows that he is arrogant and condescending and makes an attempt to change. I hate to say it, but the arrogance and condescension showed by Dalen is all too common in the real world, so yeah, the Dalen character is all the more impactful for how realistic he really is in terms of his personality. The supporting cast keeps up as well. Eric uses a lot of Shadisms and makes constant dad jokes, but still has a core of steel. The Lyra and Cusack pairing is great as they play off their different personalities. Lyra is a very cool character. She is a bit bitchy, but tries to mediate that here and there. She also has the personality of a real rape survivor. Oh dear. She was used as a sex slave as a young girl and is still dealing with it in her 30s. Any mention of sex will make her very uncomfortable. This is a realistic portrayal and is never used for cheap drama. Despite Shad's love affair with swords, the novel thankfully does not inundate the reader with constant sword fights. They are few and far between and make sense and never go on over long. They are short, sharp lessons in pain. And I guess Imperius is cool, but give me a number 4 Mark 1 any day. This is a good gateway fantasy book, as it is able to take itself seriously and be fun at the same time, and there are not 100 books of lore that you have to know to understand Word 1. And so, I am General Lotz, wishing you very good Death Watch and adequate Bruner the Bounty Hunter, or whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you this great content. I get the feeling that Shad watched a lot of DBZ in his youth because we get 2 epic Dragon Ball Z battles. As you would expect, both Rocky the Man and Lyra try and arrest Dalen because, well, both were victimized by him. Lyra, well, you guessed it, was used by Dalen for certain purposes, and A-Rock's family was killed by Dalen. In fact, Dalen killed and raped a lot of people, actually. The fights are epic, and eventually Dalus is able to stomp the cultists. The day is saved, right? And Dalus is beloved by all, right? Oh, wait. This is the Shad M Brooks novel. And I get the feeling Shaddy my boy is going to be a lot like Chris Nuttall and not let the characters just get away with anything. So, the world puts Dalus on trial for his crimes of, well, raping and killing millions of people. Like in real life, the court is split. He is bad, but he did good in both Conqueror and Jedi form. And as a superpowered Jedi, surely he should be used to fight evil, right? He is found guilty, but is remanded to the custody of the Jedi Order, where he will essentially be a slave as punishment. His handler is none other than Lyra. The end. A bit of a downer ending in some respects. Dalus does get his just desserts, but at the same time, I would have liked to have been a little happier. With that in mind, after doing some thinking, I figured out a way for the novel to be slightly happier in some respects. This is just my opinion, but here goes. Instead of having it be Dalus the Conqueror as the main character from the get-go, instead have Dalus lose his memory and think he is Dalus the Conqueror's son because he can't remember his own past. He would still have all the abilities to fight, but he wouldn't have all the baggage that Dalus the Conqueror would actually have. And this would allow for some really good dramatic irony and would make it even more suspenseful when it comes to him being found out, and it would make the exposition more tolerable. The novel could still end with Dalus joining the Jedi Order, and you could even have a cliffhanger of someone finding out who he really is just as the novel ends. And you could have had Dalus, Lyra, and Aeric become sort of a power trio. But with that in mind, the novel is still excellent, and despite all my praise for this novel, I still won't forgive Shad for killing Cusack